Okay, so let's talk about something that on the surface makes absolutely no sense. How can you give a stimulant medication, like Ritalin or Adderall, to someone with ADHD and have it make them less hyperactive? It sounds like a total paradox, right? Well, to figure it out, we're going to have to take a little trip inside the human brain.
This is the big question, isn't it? I mean, the word stimulant makes you think of something that amps you up, kind of like a double espresso. So how in the world can a medicine designed to stimulate the brain help someone with hyperactivity focus and feel calmer? The secret, it turns out, is all in the brain chemistry.
All right, so stimulants are by far the most common type of medication for treating ADHD. And the two big names you've probably heard of are methylphenidate, which you know is Ritalin, and amphetamine, which is the active ingredient in Adderall. Now, they both have the exact same goal, but as we're about to see, they take totally different routes to get there. To really get how these meds work for ADHD, we first have to understand how a typical brain sends its messages. Think of it like a constant, super high-speed balancing act, and it all comes down to chemistry.
You know, this whole story really boils down to two main characters. They're a pair of chemical messengers in your brain called neurotransmitters. Their names are dopamine and norepinephrine, and they are absolutely essential for regulating our focus, our attention, and our behavior.
Let's start with dopamine. You might have heard of it as the pleasure chemical, but honestly, its job is so much bigger than that. It's deeply connected to our sense of motivation, our reward system, and, this is super important for our chat today, our ability to pay attention.
And then you've got its partner, norepinephrine. This one is all about alertness, staying vigilant and focused. It also plays a huge part in memory and learning. So when you put them together, dopamine and norepinephrine are basically the dynamic duo that orchestrates how we engage with the world.
So, how do these guys actually deliver a message? Well, it's a simple three-step dance. First, a brain cell, a neuron, releases them into this tiny little gap called a synapse. Second, they float across that gap and bind to the next neuron, which is like delivering the mail. And third, and this part is really key, these special proteins called transporters swoop in like little vacuum cleaners and remove them from the synapse. That ends the signal. So it's release, bind, remove. That cycle is what keeps our brain's communication fast and clear.
Okay, so that's the blueprint for how it's supposed to work. Now let's talk about what's different in a brain with ADHD. We're shifting from that clean balancing act to something that can feel more like a communication breakdown.
This is really the heart of the matter. If that three-step process is our baseline, what's actually going wrong in the brain that leads to the symptoms we know as ADHD?
Now, the science is always getting better, but the leading theory right now zeroes in on that gap, the synapse. In ADHD, it's believed there are just lower levels of our two key messengers available. Imagine you're trying to listen to someone talking from across a really loud room, and their voice is just too quiet. The message just isn't getting through clearly. And when that communication signal is weak or inconsistent, what happens? Well, the results are the classic symptoms of ADHD. Having a hard time paying attention, feeling physically restless or hyperactive, and sometimes acting on impulse before thinking it through.
So if the problem is a weak signal because of a chemical imbalance, then the solution has to be restoring that balance, right? This is exactly where stimulants step in.
All right, so we've got our problem. Not enough messengers hanging out in the synapse. How do medications like Ritalin and Adderall actually fix that? Well, it turns out they use two really clever but pretty different strategies to get the job done.
This is so cool. On one side, you have Ritalin. Think of it as the blocker. It works by literally getting in the way of those little vacuum cleaner proteins, the transporters, that are trying to suck up the dopamine and norepinephrine. By blocking them, it leaves the messengers in the synapse to do their job for longer. Then you have Adderall, the releaser. It works differently. It actually goes inside the neuron and pushes more dopamine and norepinephrine out into the synapse in the first place. So one blocks the cleanup crew and the other calls for reinforcements.
So, even though their methods are totally different, blocking versus releasing, the final result is exactly the same. Both medications successfully increase the amount of dopamine and norepinephrine in the synapse, making sure there's more of them available to carry that signal.
And what does that do? It means these crucial messengers get to hang out in that gap for longer, which gives them more time to connect with and stimulate the receptors on the next neuron. It's basically like turning up the volume on the brain's signals for focus, attention, and self-control.
Okay, let's zoom out for a minute. We've been deep in the brain chemistry, but let's connect this back to a real person. What's the actual impact of all this? Why does any of this matter?
This quote really says it all. By boosting the stimulation of those key receptors, the brain just gets better at regulating itself. This directly addresses the core issue, and that leads to a real decrease in the symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. So the stimulation from the medication isn't just some random energy boost, it's a very targeted boost to the brain's own focus and control systems.
So now we see how these powerful medications can restore that delicate chemical balance in the brain. Of course, this is just one piece of the puzzle. Understanding side effects and how they're managed is a whole other crucial conversation. But for today, the big takeaway is this. By targeting these specific chemical messengers, stimulants can help turn down the noise of ADHD and turn up the signal for focus and control.